This is MTSS 101, The Essentials, presented by Jamie Harris.
So today what we're going to be going through is talking a little bit about what the key components are of MTSS and why districts would be implementing an MTSS. We'll talk through what this really implies for practitioners on a daily basis. So what does it look like in action? We'll move into evaluating the effectiveness of those implementations and where I've seen districts kind of fall short and sometimes, and also talk about some of the struggles that districts have encountered when trying to implement an MTSS. At the end, we'll leave some time for some questions, so feel free to throw those questions our way, and we'll be sure to take some time at the end to talk through some of the answers if possible. And I'm going to start here with a definition of what MTSS is. So MTSS, we should be thinking about as a real framework in which we can place a variety of different supports for students. So it really takes a look at tiering the infrastructure that we have so that we have a majority of our students that are needing, that are responding to our core instruction. We have some students who are going to need some additional supports, and then a smaller percentage of students who need some intensive supports. And with the number of needs that we have to be thoughtful about resourcing appropriately. And so with that, we want to be thoughtful about using our data to help us match the academic, social, emotional, and behavioral needs through high quality assessments and providing appropriate instructional resources to each and every student's needs. And that last point there with each and every student's needs is really critical to the idea of MTSS. We are talking about helping to support and identify all students so that we can make sure that as an education system, we are supporting every student. And so sometimes it's helpful for us to think about MTSS in terms of an analogy. And so a lot of the principles that we have for MTSS really are derived from public health services. In schools, we're working to most effectively use our resources to meet the needs of all students. And we do the same thing with medical resources. So in most places, we have places in the community for all people to get their health cleaned or their teeth cleaned regularly. We've resourced dentists to provide services for that, and sometimes we even have dentists who come into our schools to make sure that we're doing screenings and providing those services for kids. And what we're doing there is we're hoping that those preventative services of getting their teeth cleaned regularly are effective so that not everybody needs advanced care, such as oral surgery, which is a pretty intense treatment demanding more resources and more training, more people with more training. And so if everybody needed that intense service, we don't have the resources right now in our communities to provide the number of surgeries that that would demand. So thinking about early intervention services and prevention is a really key component to MTSS. So when we think about the dental analogy, if our preventative system, which includes the use of fluoride treatments often, flossing and brushing, if that's successful, we don't need as many oral surgeons, and the number of general practitioner dentists, which we have more of, would help to meet the needs of students. So in schools, MTSS is very similar. We work to have highly effective instruction in the classroom so that fewer students need intensive intervention to be successful. And if they do need services for those smaller number of students who need additional supports and services, we can be intensive enough to really result in helping to support students so that they're successful. So why would school districts want to implement an MTSS, or why are we finding that school districts are implementing an MTSS? It's because we want to improve the outcomes for all students from the academic, behavioral, and social emotional lens. So looking at students not just from their academic needs, but also thinking about the different behaviors and different skills that they need to develop in order to become a productive member of society. We want to make sure that we're addressing the unmet needs of so many students and subgroups. We also think that the idea of de-siloing the number of different practices that we're implementing, and sometimes we had different buckets of people who would be providing services and providing education opportunities to our subgrouped students. At times, we were finding that it's not as successful as what we can do with MTSS, which really helps us to take apart having different groups of people work with different students. And it helps us make our systems and processes more effective and connected within our school district. So we start to see that schools are starting to look at all of the different meetings that they're having and trying to come up with a more streamlined approach to ensuring that we're meeting the needs of all students and that we have like an aligned vision in schools, which is, I think, a really cool thing and an outcome of MTSS. We want to move our students along, no matter where they are, if they're at, above, or below our expectations. So we want to help to make sure that all students are growing and that we're meeting them where they are in order for them to be successful. And we also are finding that people are really wanting to take a whole child approach to supporting students. And when we think about whole child, I'll get into this a little bit later, but whole child means that we're looking at students not just from that academic kind of perspective, but we're taking a look at their needs from the home environment to how they're conducting themselves within the community, those social skills that they need in order to be successful in the community, in the classroom, and in the future when they're an adult, so that we're making sure that when a student leaves us, that they have the variety of skills that they need in order to become, like I said, that successful member of society. We also find that there's a high number of implications that have been founded in policy, and specifically in ESSA, which I'll talk about right now. So we're seeing that MTSS is becoming more widespread because of educational policy that has passed over the years. And there have been two main buckets really that have kind of caused this to kind of ramp up in terms of the need. So back in the 70s, we had the introduction of IDEA and the need for us to provide special education services to our students. In 1997, that was reauthorized, and at that point, they incorporated the idea of encouraging folks to start thinking about providing positive behavioral interventions and supports. So the idea of PBIS was introduced in 1997, and that implied that there was funding that was directed towards special education specifically. And in 2001, we had the introduction of NCLB. And at this point, we really saw a ramp up in terms of putting a focus on reading and math proficiency for all students, and that all students needed to be assessed. This really was the impetus for the beginning of some key data analysis that we have been really starting to do more of in schools. And with that, we would start to look at not only looking at, the core average student and how they were responding and making sure that they were proficient, but really looking at the different subgroups of students within our schools. So with that, we started to notice that sometimes we were over-identifying students for special education, or that the students in special education weren't making as much progress as those students who weren't found to be in special education. So in 2004, with the reauthorization of IDEA there, the idea of response to intervention was incorporated. With that, there was additional funding in order to help schools provide supplemental programs and special education funds into general education. So at this point, we started to see the idea that early intervening services was important and that more focus needed to be put toward prevention as opposed to later response or later intervening services. And typically we would find that students would become eligible for special education around 4th grade, and we were finding that that was too late for students to actually make the progress that they needed. So the idea here is that that IDEA kind of spearheaded this idea of looking at how students were responding to interventions and ensuring that we were putting supports into place for those students. So for 11 years, that was the idea. I know a lot of schools started to even incorporate RTI into the identification of students with learning disabilities specifically. So that's kind of across the nation, we've seen a big difference in terms of how states have taken the 2004 reauthorization and incorporated that. So in 2015, we had the ESEA, which actually turned then into Every Student Succeeds Act, and the main thing that we're seeing here is that the focus has shifted to all students and making sure that every student is really successful because of what we were seeing for the years previous. And the big thing here is that we're finding that schools are choosing to implement MTSS, that even though it's not regulated or a federal mandate that students or that schools must implement an MTSS, schools are choosing it because it helps really to take a look at the different recommendations and the different policies that states are putting forth, and it puts it into a framework that is actually successful. So we're going to get into how that looks in schools. The interesting thing I think that we have to think about, and kind of a paradigm shift that helps us to think about and kind of ground ourselves in what MTSS does that's different than maybe in the past, is that we used to look at trying to help fix kids or help provide supports to those kids. But we as school practitioners have never improved. We've not gotten better by fixing kids. Kids come into us with what they have, and they don't need to be fixed. Kids do the best that they can with what they have, and we as school practitioners need to ensure that we're providing those supports to those students by being able to support the adults in changing the way that we work with students, which I think is maybe a different approach or a different way of thinking about what we're doing. So with RTI in the past, it was the student has a need. I need to identify that they have a need so that we can get, a special education teacher to work with them, as opposed to now thinking about what supports do we have available in our school to help support all of our students in a real systematic approach. So it really is a framework that changes how the adults in a school system, how we do our work and engage in a problem-solving process. So the essential components that we see within MTSS is definitely widespread and different across the nation. So this is just a few different examples that we have of some specific state frameworks that exist in the nation. And you'll see here that we have, everyone has kind of defined it a little bit differently. We have it sometimes being called a multi-tiered system of supports. You'll see system of support. You'll see systems of support. So the language that we're using in school districts and in states is certainly widespread, but there are definitely some key components that we're starting to see kind of pop up. So here are some different components that these states specifically have identified. And as you start to unpack them, while they look like they're different, they're actually more alike than they are different. So we see a lot of threads and patterns with state frameworks suggesting that there be a team-based or kind of collaborative approach to addressing and resourcing appropriately for students and their needs. We see the idea of continuous improvement and tiering our supports and layering in a variety of supports for students. Those are all kind of addressing the same thing. We see there being a common thread about database decision making and being able to select students appropriately who need those services. We also see that screening and assessment as a key component to a lot of these state frameworks. So when we think about the different ways that what we're calling our state frameworks, and then how the district would, implement this or interpret what the state is suggesting, we see that schools are, in fact, doing a lot of similar things. So here at Illuminate, these are the 5 components that we've identified as the key pieces in order for schools to kind of create that framework. So if you're at the beginning stages of trying to figure out, what are those key components, this is what we've observed from a national perspective are those 5 key kind of areas. And I'm gonna get into these in a little bit more detail, but I'll quickly just go through. You see here that the schools typically have an inviting climate and culture that encompasses some high quality leadership that helps to support our infrastructure that is very intentionally integrated throughout our school, that we also are pulling in our students, families, and communities as part of our MTSS frameworks, and that the key component, which is where we're going to spend a good chunk of our time today, is talking about how we would match our assessment, instruction, and intervention supports for students. So we're going to start with that one. So let's try to unpack this a little bit. We have our assessment, instruction, and intervention, which are interconnected, effective, aligned to a student's needs, and informed by data. So the different things that we tend to see here are that we have a number of different measures and ways that we're being able to identify students' strengths and needs in the areas of academics, in behavior, and their social emotional skills. We often find that schools have or are working toward improving having a balanced assessment system, and that when we think about how we're supporting those students, that those services and instruction are going to be tiered in order to appropriately meet the amount of students that have the needs with the amount of services that we have, so that there's a nice balance, that we're not overly identifying and saying that every student in our school needs to have an individualized plan. We take a more systematic approach to it and making sure that we're resourcing appropriately while also being able to support all students. So I'll get into a little bit more detail about how you can do that in your school. When we think about what I think about is the underlying this is what a school has to kind of feel like. It's that schools should have an inviting climate and culture. And this is an area that's really important to help our parents become more engaged in our class, to have our students want to come to our classrooms. We have kids who are coming to us with more needs than we've ever had in the past. Students with high trauma, with the number of school shootings that we also experience, that we're seeing increase, and even shootings in the community, people are more impacted. So we are hoping that our schools can provide a safe, welcoming environment to anybody in our communities, so that our schools are a place where students can learn. And so we also want to think about making sure that we are non-discriminatory in the environments that we're creating, so that students can in fact focus on learning and know that they are accepted and supported here. So some examples that we tend to see is that schools are implementing a variety of things around the area of being culturally and linguistically responsive to the students' needs. So making sure that when we're talking, that we talk in a way that supports and encourages all students to feel like they're part of the environment. And in fact, parents as well. Not every parent feels comfortable. Maybe they have negative associations with schools. So we need to make sure that we're creating that welcoming environment for all stakeholders, for students. We think about the emotional, physical, and mental wellness, different key components that we're implementing within schools. We should have some sort of curriculum in place in order to address each of these areas. And you'll also still continue to see the idea of bullying prevention programs being in place. And that's important, again, to make sure that it increases the likelihood that we have a welcoming environment. The leadership often that we see, this piece has to be in place, and at Illuminate we have a number of ways from professional services that we can even help support the leadership efforts in your school. But the idea here is that we have to be very deliberate about how we allocate time and resources for district and site leaders to be able to build that capacity so that we can create the supportive structures that are sensitive to all students' needs. So again, when we think about the difference in terms of, in the past, maybe it was identifying one student at a time. Instead, we have to really rely on having our leaders be able to help support and create these environments so that we're appropriately resourcing and providing training opportunities for our school, the people who are implementing these efforts in schools. So some of the examples and the ways that our leaders might be able to do this are to provide systematic analysis for patterns and trends with a responsive system level strategic action. So with that, if we notice that there's an issue, being able to put something in place to help support that so that it doesn't continue is a really key component. So a way that you can do that is to constantly review the resources that we've allocated for different services, and then take that look at, okay, if we've implemented this practice, how effective was it really? And so that we're working in that continuous improvement cycle. We want to consistently and continuously build capacity in all of our practices and with all of the key stakeholders in our schools. So we want to make sure that we're communicating and creating good expectations around how can we provide culturally and linguistically opportunities so that our staff understand what that means, and that we can better support teachers to build the capacity in all of these areas. So when we think about the infrastructure, this is what are the things that we're putting into place in order for us to really integrate all of the different things so that we can really de-silo our approaches to in our efforts to supporting students. So we have to be very deliberate about developing, prioritizing, investing in, and providing system level support to a connected and collaborative ecosystem of people, processes, and tools. So this is one of those, we must have this piece in place in order for us to do the work of MTSS. So that system piece is really important in this component. Different things that we see schools doing are providing professional learning opportunities and encouraging the idea of collaboration. This isn't, I'm going to pass my data off to, the school psychologist or the data analyst and expect them to digest it and then, give it back to me as the teacher. It's us all working together to think about what we have in place. We want to make sure that we're aligning our policies, communicating about those, and also creating and improving the processes that we have about data analysis. And that everything, like I said, is aligned to a common vision and mission. Another key component here, an example that we've seen increasing, is the idea of intervention effectiveness and program effectiveness and evaluation. So taking a look and making sure that we're taking a look at whatever we're implementing in our school, do we have the data that we need, easily accessible, to help us make decisions about whether what we've implemented, the things that we're doing, are they in fact making a difference for all students? Because if we're spending so much time on implementing these resources or implementing these interventions or instruction, do we have the proof that it's working? And if not, do we have the ability to answer why is it not working? So being able to drill into our data to be able to make those decisions about if it's not working, why? So our student, family, and community engagement piece is definitely an important one, and something that we really want to make sure that we're sharing, our efforts with the number of key stakeholders for with our students. So this typically includes having a shared involvement, communication, and investment in student success across the wider environment. So this is kind of tapping into that whole child view. And if we have some work that we have to do to help parents in their school or in their homes to be able to better support their child at home, we can work directly with the parents in our schools to be able to provide maybe some training for those families. We also want to make sure, some examples that you're going to see here, that we're taking a look at seeing our parents and other agencies in the community as a partner, and so that we can kind of all have shared responsibility to helping support our students. So I've seen definitely a high number or an increase in the number of supports from mental health agencies being able to work more closely with schools, even being able to provide some intervention at no cost to the school or to the families, which is a really important and really a neat thing for our communities, and a benefit that we've seen being able to partner and bring those key stakeholders into our schools. So another key piece is that we have communication. So we need to make sure that we're pulling in our parents and sharing that what we're working for to help support students. So if a parent has a concern, that their voice is just as much heard, and even students to have their voice to be able to say, hey, here's what our concerns are, and here are some things that I want to see happen for my student, for myself, and so that everybody kind of has choice about how we can support students. So when we think about what this looks like for practitioners on a daily basis, we're going to move from that system level kind of view into our daily actions. So most of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis really happen in this kind of bucketed area, this component that's called matched assessment, instruction, and intervention. So high level here, you're going to hear me talk about the problem-solving cycle. We're going to talk through some whole child measures, talk through what a balanced assessment system is, and talk about the different tiered instruction opportunities and supports that all students should have. We're going to talk through progress monitoring and also how to evaluate effectiveness of those interventions. So our problem-solving cycle begins with the idea of identifying student strengths and needs, analyzing and forming a plan, implementing that plan, and then coming back to reflect and evaluate whether or not the interventions or the supports or the instruction that we're providing is in fact improving and meeting the students' needs. If not, we continue to identify those strengths and needs and continue to go through this cycle, and it really should be nonstop. Everything starts with data, and I always say it starts with data, it should never end with data. So if you see a data point, you see assessment results, that's not the end of the story. That's just helping us to identify maybe that there's a strength or a weakness or a strength or a need that we have in our school. So it always should start with data. And the different data that we have at our fingertips is certainly vast, but all of these data points really help us to have a different lens about how a student is functioning. So when we hear whole child, I'd encourage you to think about these are the different measures and different ways that we can start to unveil that whole child. And so we know that a data point, a test score, the number of times this child has been suspended is not the whole story. We should be looking at children from a variety of different ways. This is just one aspect to help us see from a kind of a quantitative perspective about how a student is performing. And it's really interesting when we look at the number of different data points that we have available to us at our fingertips on a daily basis, how much there is. But if we can tie all of this data together, we can have an approach to support our students so that they can succeed and have we can have a support system built that is data informed, that's interconnected, and shifts away from that singular focus just on that academic perspective that maybe we used to have in the past. So when NCLB was introduced, and even when RTI was introduced, there was definitely a wide focus just on, or kind of a granular focus on that academic perspective. And what we're seeing here is that there's a number of different ways that we should be looking at how students are performing and what their needs are. So I think about these measures in 3 different buckets. So we have our academic measures, we have behavioral measures, and we have social emotional measures. You see here that the academic measures are those state tests, classroom gradebook scores, we have our screening data, we have some different task rubrics to help us identify how a student is performing. We have their daily assignments, we have formative assessment, we have different data on their achievement and attainment in different areas in our classrooms, and we also should be looking at growth data as well as any of those additional data points related to college and career readiness. So that's just looking at our academic measures that we often have. We also have some behavioral measures that we should be taking a look at, and those include our referrals that we're sending. So students, when they're referred to the office, some districts call this your major incidents or your office managed incidents. And then there's an additional number of incidents that you should be recording, and you might be recording already. Sometimes they're what we refer to as minors or teacher managed, or even just general concerns that somebody has about a student. Those are all really key pieces to thinking about how a student is behaving, and helps us to kind of peel back the layer about why a student might be misbehaving or what might be happening to lead to them having some behavioral incidents and infractions. Another key piece here is our attendance data and absenteeism data. Those are key indicators to sometimes other issues that can definitely impact how a student is performing within the classroom. We have our direct behavior ratings that is a great way to progress monitor. We have daily progress reports on students that are often being filled out. Health office visits is one of my is an interesting way that I encourage schools to look at the data for, especially for internalizing students. So those tummy aches and headaches reports, and what classrooms are they coming out of most often. So interesting ways to use that data to help us kind of think about where a student might be struggling. We have suspension data, we might have awards and recognition data. We also have some tardy data, which is sometimes a good indication of the whole system in the school. Why do we have so many kids tardy immediately, after a break time or something? And what can we do to prevent that from being an issue for all students? We also have social emotional data, and this is an area near and dear to my heart, but we have a number of different ways that we can be looking at how a student's social emotional skills are. So we have risk levels, we have competency scores, and we have rating scales often that we see. We have different ways that we can screen and assess for social emotional learning. Climate and perception surveys are often included here. You might have some different measures for mental health, different measures for trauma, specifically like the ACEs, if you don't know what that is, it's ACES, so Adverse Childhood Experiences, which is an interesting way for us to think about the likelihood that a child might have some difficulty as a result of different events that have occurred in their life. We have different ways that we can measure social skills and emotion regulation, and those interpersonal skills that are really important for students to be able to get along with everyone. So when we think about all of those different measures that we have, and we kind of bucket them into this flow for identifying, so assessing and identifying the interventions and supports that students have, this tends to be kind of the progression that we see happening in schools. So you go from identifying, analyzing, implementing, and reflecting. Within each of those steps, we have the need to identify comes with universal screening, and that's to identify the students who are at risk in your schools. We have our skill analysis and diagnostics, which help us to pinpoint the exact area of need. Then we move into, okay, we know what the problem is. Now let's do something about it. And so here's where our intervention piece comes in. And this tends to be where we spend most of our time, and where I see sometimes all of our efforts are focused just on intervention. What's really important here is that we're aligning the need identified by data. A common pitfall is that we're not always looking at and thinking about the different assessments that we're giving and knowing what that assessment was intended to measure, and sometimes making assumptions that with the intervention that maybe isn't appropriately matched to the student's need. So we then, in order for us to make sure that the student is progressing, we have different progress monitoring tools that help us to track whether or not that intervention is in fact working. And then we have that last step here of evaluating so that we can adjust, continue, or fade out the interventions. And that's another area that I see schools just not doing. They take a look at when kids aren't responding, but they don't necessarily have the decision rules or data point rules that we have to help us know when we should continue an intervention or fade it out or adjust it in some way. So our balanced assessment system, in order for us to think about, if so much of what we're doing is based on those assessments, we need to think about why we're giving the assessments we're giving and what they're intended to do. So this is how many balanced assessment systems are viewed across districts in the nation. So we have our, what we call kind of our informal or just-in-time assessments. Some people refer to those as your formative assessments. Just throwing out a list of different examples that maybe you might have heard of. Your interims, which are going to be given less often or more in between. And then you have your summatives, which are really going to be given at the end of a unit to make sure that students are a summary of their learning overall. So when we think about our balanced assessment in terms of MTSS, we have a few other pieces that we're going to be throwing in here, which I referenced in that screen previously. So we have our informal just in time, then we typically move into universal screenings, looking at that data, and then we can move into, for some kids, giving those skills analysis and diagnostic measures, making sure that we're doing some progress monitoring. And then also we'll likely be giving some interims. So those are the classroom assessments often, and what are they learning and how are they learning and what do I need to do as a teacher to shift my instruction. And then at the end of the unit, making sure that students have acquired the skills that we're hoping they have. So when we think about universal screenings, we want to make sure that we're administering these assessments to all students, that they're quick, valid, and reliable. Specifically, identifying students who are at risk or in need of support is a key outcome of universal screening, and this is typically done 2 to 3 times per year. When we think about our skills analysis and diagnostic measures, these are going to be administered for students, grade levels, or groups that are flagged by universal screening. So if we see that a large number of students came up as needing something for screening, we might have additional data already that helps us to know kind of a standard treatment protocol, that if students have a deficit in this area, we know which intervention is appropriate. We don't have to administer a skill analysis or diagnostic for every student who comes up as at risk in the universal screening measures. Really a small number of kids should be getting these skills analysis and diagnostic, typically students who are at that tier 3 level. So that would be typically about 5 to 10% or 1 to 5% of our students in the district who should need that kind of intensive assessment. We also are thinking about identifying the specific area of need when we're thinking about the diagnostic tool that we have. And sometimes this data is already available to us as part of the universal screening data. So when we think about accuracy data, there's a number of ways that we can use the accuracy data alongside the screening score to make decisions about what their needs are. And then we move into our progress monitoring. So students who are receiving tier 2 and tier 3 interventions should be progress monitored. Those should be aligned to specific skills or needs, and they're very sensitive to growth. These also help to develop, or we're monitoring for foundational skills which are needed to master the standards that we're often using on some of our standards measures within the classroom. So when we think about that, we have these different assessments that are really intended to measure different things. So you can see here that sometimes our screenings and skills analysis and progress monitoring are typically more focused on some discrete skills, where sometimes the standards are a little bit more high level that encompass a number of different foundational skills that a student needs. So that assessment piece we hit on. Now we're moving into intervention. And what does that really mean? So an intervention is an instructional resource or support aligned to students' needs. They should be research-based, and there's a difference between research-based and evidence-based. If we're administering a tier 2 or tier 3 intervention, we should be pretty sure, based on scientific data, that other students with a need like this have responded to the intervention. That's different than an evidence-based need or evidence-based intervention, which is, I've had some experience as a teacher doing this intervention and I'm going to implement it. You might be able to do that for tier 2 students who have tier 2 needs, but with students who have real intensive needs, who have a big gap between where their skill is versus that of others, we have to be very thoughtful about the interventions that we're selecting. So we need to make sure that we're adjusting our instructional actions to better match the students' needs. Interventions don't just necessarily need to be for struggling students. And remember that interventions aren't just related to their academic needs. We could be talking about social skills or emotion regulation skills that are really an important piece for student success overall. So when we're implementing our interventions, there's some key pieces that you will want to think about. So you're going to identify the student need based on data, using specific data rules and decision rules. You're going to analyze and create that plan. And often you don't have to just give every student their own individual plan. You can have students be part of a group if they all have a similar need. When you implement the plan, it's important to take attendance and monitor and measure the students' participation and engagement in the intervention sessions, so that we know how often are kids coming, and when they come, are they actually engaged in what we're doing, or are they just there with their body and they're not actually engaged in the intervention. So we should be collecting data on that. We should be administering and recording scores. So those are the progress monitoring data points. And then also adding in intervention comments. So that kind of what I call the qualitative data that we're collecting. So what was it that we did and how were they responding? Just kind of to help us understand how were they doing in the intervention session. And then that last piece there is reflecting. So we're making plan changes often. We're using those decision rules again, and we're making the decision whether we're going to change, continue, or fade out the intervention. So sometimes when we fade out, or if we exit the student from intervention, we've maybe determined that there's been a number of interventions we've tried, and now this is the time where special education services might be needed. I would encourage you to use this MTSS cycle, though, even if a student is identified as having a special education need. Sometimes students get placed in special education and then we just assume that they should stay there, and that's definitely not what MTSS is saying. So we should really be thoughtful about making sure that we're using this cycle for all students who are receiving specialized services within our schools. So again, these interventions and instruction opportunities should be available for all students at different levels. So tier 3, we'll start with tier 1. We can think about looking at the data and the needs and the instruction opportunities from all facets. So looking at academic, behavior, and social emotional. Tier 1, we should be typically 80 to 90% of our students will be in that tier 1 service delivery, and that they'll just be receiving high quality classroom instruction. We'll often see that schools will have tier 2 services in place, and everybody calls these things differently too. We hear levels, we hear other fancy names that schools come up with. So whatever you want to name it, you can, but know that tier 2 tends to mean that we're talking about 5 to 15% of our students, and the interventions that we're delivering are pretty targeted to a student's need. But these are often implemented in a small group setting. And then we have a smaller subset of our population that is having intensive intervention. So that's typically about 1 to 5% of our students. I will point out here that you don't have to move, you don't have to receive Tier 1 services and then move into Tier 2 and then move into Tier 3. If we have identified that a student has a Tier 3 need, that their needs are such that we need to provide intensive intervention, we should provide that intervention to the student. But we should also be looking at whether or not we're providing supports to the number of students. So making sure that we're not exceeding 5% of the students receiving intensive interventions. Because again, when we think about resource allocation, this is really important. So we have to look at data from a different perspective. So we can look at our whole child data to identify need and to align those interventions appropriately. So we can pull in our quantitative data and our qualitative data to help us make decisions about students from a variety of ways. So this is a screenshot you see here from EduClimber, which helps you to identify behavioral needs, academic needs, and even teacher comments that have been made, which helps us to see kind of the whole child approach. When we move into identifying the student, we need to make sure that we're thoughtful about setting goals for students. So our academic goals, typically you're going to combine your rate of improvement, and you're going to be thinking about where do we want the student to be at the end of the year. You should be evaluating the trend line and the rate of improvement. When you're analyzing your progress monitoring data, you should notice that 80% of the data points on a chart are near each other. And that helps us to know that the scores that we're getting are in fact valid and reliable. Sometimes it's okay to eliminate scores when we see that students are misbehaving. So if they weren't engaged when we gave them a CBM progress monitoring assessment, it's okay to get rid of it if they didn't participate. So we want to make sure that the data that we're getting is accurate. We also want to think before we make high stakes decisions about students that we're gathering at least 10 data points before we make those decisions. For behavior, when we're thinking about our progress monitoring and setting goals, you can do things around direct behavior ratings, daily progress reports, and typically when we set our goal for daily progress reports, we want to have 80% of the points possible that a student is earning be sustained over 4 weeks before we make decisions about exiting or changing interventions. Here's another screenshot from EduClimber. This is to help us think about when we're thinking about students and them being engaged in the intervention, we have a way here to see whether or not the student attended the intervention. Did we implement the intervention at the frequency we said we would, and for how long we said we would. So being able to have that data at your fingertips when you're making decisions about students is really important. Our progress monitoring, we have some different probes or different measures and ways that we can assess how a student is progressing. So we have two different kind of types. We have our general outcome measures and we have our skill-based measures. And you want to typically alternate these weekly. So 1 week you'd give a general outcome measure, which is really going to look at comparing the student's progress toward like grade level expectations. And then you have a skill-based measure, which is really focused on that specific skill that we're trying to address through the intervention. So that's that skill-based probe. And again, you'd want to alternate 1 week a general outcome measure, the next week a skill-based measure. When we analyze that data, there's some different things that we should be considering. I went through a couple of those a little bit ago, but another key point here is the ability for you to be able to analyze how accurate a student is in their intervention or in their responses. So if a student is making a high number of errors, likely the intervention should be more focused on teaching the student the skill. When we're talking about fluency measures, that typically those interventions should be focused on the student has the skill to do it, they just need more practice. So accuracy, if we see that a high number of our students have low accuracy scores or have a high number of errors, or high rate of errors, that's a concern and likely an indication that the intervention you're implementing is more practice oriented than teaching the student the specific skill that they need in order to make progress. So again, accuracy is a big piece here that sometimes is overlooked. After we've implemented these interventions, a key piece here is the ability for us to evaluate how effective the intervention is and our implementation of those interventions. So this is kind of something that I've thrown together. I've seen some schools doing it. I was introduced to it back in 2008 by Joe Kowaleski, and some work being done in Pennsylvania. And this is kind of my synthesis of what I've seen actually working in schools. So typically there's like 3 different data analysis teams, and the purpose of those are for us to see whether what we're doing to support kids is in fact helpful. And to make decisions, if it's not, why? Is it because our people don't have training? Is it because we don't have the time? Maybe we're being pulled out of the intervention opportunities and we're not actually doing the interventions. So our universal data analysis team, the question we're asking there, are students responding to Tier 1 instruction? We should be looking at the data 2 to 3 times per year, looking at all students and how they're responding. So if we don't have 70 to 80% of our students who are at a proficiency level that are not proficiency level, but who are not at risk, that's a concern. That means that we're going to be identifying more than 20% of our students to need intensive intervention or targeted intervention. And we need to kind of shift it and say, if we have that high number of students, so like in my district, we sometimes had up to 45 to 50% of our students identified as having an at-risk level. So that was a concern for us. We couldn't give one-on-one interventions to 50% of our students. So we had to do something at the Tier 1 or at our core instruction level and change things on its head. So that's a really key thing that you should be thinking about. After we've identified a number of our students who need interventions, we should be implementing a what I call as an intervention data analysis team. So that's how each student is responding to his or her intervention. Those should be conducted every 3 weeks for students receiving a behavioral or social emotional learning intervention, and every 6 weeks for academics. For our the next step, which is really fun, is that every 12 weeks, any student who's receiving intervention, we should be looking at how effective are those intervention programs based on the general outcome measures. So is what we're doing in the moment working on improving their overall skills and decreasing the gaps that we've observed in the past? And so thinking about this from this kind of perspective has been helpful for some school districts. It's also important for us to be able to pull the data really quickly. So this is a screenshot of EduClimber. You can drill down into the data, see the students. You can also see their progress from fall to spring and how many kids are we closing the gaps for. Being able to look at our behavior data and also being able to look at our attendance data and make some analysis decisions about that. So different questions, again, that you're going to want to consider. We move from screening to proficiency to growth. We want to start usually with looking at screening data, and the question we're asking there is what percentage of our students are at risk? That's different than proficiency. So because a student isn't at risk doesn't mean that they're proficient in a skill. So that's an important distinction that we often need to make. Our state level assessments are typically looking at proficiency skills. Then we should also be thinking about our data from the lens of growth, and that's important too when we're thinking about the different trends that we're seeing and across our cohorts. So if we see that there's a problem, is that a trend with this grade level, or is it specific to this cohort of students? So here's an example of some ways that you can analyze in EduClimber how students are progressing. This is a behavior intervention. If students aren't responding, do we know why? Did they intend the intervention? Were they engaged in it? And do we see different trends that are occurring for this particular student? When we think about the program data analysis team, this is an example of how you can use the data to see, again, if they're not responding, do we have the data at our fingertips to answer why are they not responding? And then with that program evaluation, another way that we can look at all of our students who are receiving interventions, from the students who are highest performing down to the students who are having some significant needs. We can ask these questions really quickly. And the key thing here with EduClimber specifically, but for anything that we're doing with MTSS, is that while it's a system level approach, what we're really working toward is to make sure that all of the data and all of the efforts that we're putting in place are in fact helping to support every student. So in EduClimber, are all of the data points that we're making, the decisions that we're making, all of it eventually ends up here on the student page. And so we can see historically what interventions they've been part of, how have they been performing academically, what additional data points do we have on students to help us know whether there are some needs that we haven't met yet, or have we made the progress that we're hoping so that the student can become successful. So these are typically the struggles that we observe schools having, and the tools that we have at Illuminate specifically help with each of these. So especially the de-siloing of data, helping to support a systematic kind of approach, being able to track your implementation efforts, gives you the tools you need for collaboration. You can use the assessments that we have and to make a more balanced assessment system, and to make it so that all the data points that we have aren't so overwhelming. So with that, we have a few minutes left, and I'm going to pass it back over to Lynn.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jamie. And we do have a couple of questions. We don't have too much time, but we'll try to get to them. If you haven't sent your question over, please be sure to, so we can follow up afterwards if we don't have time to get to it today. Before I forget though, please be sure to join us next week. We're doing part 2 of this series, and that's Making MTSS Work, presented by Kate Pahacek. If you've already registered for the series, you're good to go. You don't need to register again, but if you have a colleague that wants to join us, they should go ahead and register there. The biggest questions we're having is, number 1, what product is this? This is Illuminate EduClimber, and I'll go ahead and put a link in the chat box for that. Go ahead and check that out, and if you have any questions, let us know. Other big questions: do we have a copy of the slide deck and the recording? Yes, of course, and we'll send links out for those to all registrants. First question, I'll try to whiz through these. Who would you recommend doing the interventions? Should it be a certified teacher, since the students are the ones needing the most support?
It depends on what staff you have available. The biggest key thing there is that whoever the person is doing the intervention should be trained to do that intervention. I've often seen that schools will have somebody designated to do interventions. Sometimes it can be a bit much to ask a classroom teacher to do core instruction plus do pullouts for intervention groups. I've seen some success with that, but typically it's a different person than the classroom teacher. Unless the student has some significant behavioral needs, or we're talking about a behavioral intervention or sometimes a social emotional intervention, sometimes the classroom teacher is the best person suited to do that because they have a really strong relationship with the student. But I think the key thing there is that whatever intervention that you're doing, that person should be highly qualified, meaning that they've had the training, and we've as a district have allocated resources to get the person the training that they need.
Awesome, super helpful. One more question before we wrap up. How easy is it to enter majors and minors in EduClimber?
We see that a lot of school districts choose to no longer enter it into the student information system, or only choose to enter the significant ones that they report to the state in their student information system, and opt to use what we have available in EduClimber because it's very customizable. You can access it on your phone, and we've heard that it's easy, and we're always making the product better. And so we've made some improvements recently to make it even more of a delightful experience.
And part B of that question, if they wanted to sync in their behavior data into EduClimber, is that possible?
Yep, we do with almost every student information system. The data can be imported into EduClimber for a more easy process to analyze that data on a nightly basis. It all depends on the student information system that you're using in your school district.
Awesome. That's all the time we have for today. We're at the top of the hour, but thank you so much everyone for joining us, and friendly reminder to join us again next week. Again, if you're already registered for this part, you're good to go for next week, but if you want to invite colleagues, they should go ahead and register. Thank you again, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and thank you, Jamie, for an awesome presentation.
My honor, and thank you all.